Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Agile IT Tech Talk. This is Sean Spicer, head of marketing over here at Agile IT. Today, I am joined by Miguel, who you are familiar with if you've been in some prior Tech Talks. He's one of our smarter engineers about here. Today, what he's going to be discussing is right-sizing virtual machines. So a couple weeks ago, we did one with Maggie about right-sizing your Office 365 licenses and how utilization or managing your utilization based on your business's needs can save you a lot of money versus going with one-size-fits-all approaches. So how you doing today, Miguel?
I'm doing great. I think that you touched on a very interesting subject, Sean, that is right-sizing the VMs. Usually, it's a topic that's not often touched because, they're VMs. That's what they're set to do. Usually what happens is VMs end up mismatched because of a couple of things. First is, how did we get here? Well, let's just go on a couple of topics here. First, what is right sizing? Well, right sizing means actually matching the resource demands of your application to the available resources on your virtual machine. What does that mean? Well, if you have a 16 processor machine running 64 gigs of RAM and your application only needs 2 processors and 8 gigs of RAM, you're grossly over provisioning the machine, meaning that you can be saving a lot of money having it right sized because you don't need that many resources. This really is something where you need to do an evaluation constantly of. It depends also on the, if your business is a seasonal based business, like let's say sales, if you have big sales, right now, right out of the holiday season, maybe your retail shop, the majority of the business that you get is during the holiday season. Maybe it makes sense for you to either create availability set, which is multiple copies. Let's assume we're talking about a DB server of that. You can scale them up or down, being multiple threads. That would require some application re-architecting, or just going back to this topic, moving the resources up or down. Maybe it makes sense for you to have, 8 processors, 64 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of RAM during your high season because you're going to have a lot more demand. But in the off season, you may not need it. You may be, you may be using a lot less. That's really taking advantage of cloud economics, right? Being elastic enough to be able to save money when you don't need the resources and scale up when you do without needing to make a significant purchase. The other thing that this does is it reduces operational overhead. Why is that? Well, let's assume you have large disks, or let's assume you have small disks, right? They're not right sized. You have databases that are growing, running out of space. You have stuff that's crashing because of blue screen of death because you don't have enough memory. That can happen if your machine isn't correctly sized. Now, you may just have that problem come to, the realization, well, that's normal because it's a virtual machine. Ever since we virtualized it, that's become the norm. It's not. It may be because of this. Moving on, this is one case study we did actually for a customer. Well, the numbers have been moved a little bit.
Yeah, these are real results that Maggie was able to achieve for one of our CSP customers. And if you've seen the Tech Talk or were part of it, you're familiar with this. We realized almost $6,000 saving a month by identifying redundancies when their Office 365 licenses. Now, they were perfect 2 years ago. That's what they needed. But over time, things changed, and nobody had ever taken the time to go in and do an audit. So this is showing the value of another type of right sizing. Miguel, how do virtual machines get wrong sized?
Well, I think we're sort of introducing these two terms right now as acceptable terms. That's the ones we use here in Agile as our tech jargon here. But
an inside joke.
It is mainly because of two things. One is technology evolution, meaning that you had a machine, you virtualized it, you were running X amount of resources as a virtual machine on-prem or as a physical machine on premises, and you decided to take that up to the cloud. And you said, well, apples to apples. Well, not necessarily. One is usually servers that get virtualized are because they've been working in that role for a while. For example, that means that if I'm virtualizing a machine today, the trend is it's usually been stable and in production for about a year. So that means I've been at least using year-old hardware, which is not the case in cloud. They're constantly revving and renewing their hardware, especially Azure. Second is, it doesn't necessarily need to be in the cloud to be wrong sized. It may just be vendor specification that says, hey, you need this many resources to operate the machine. Well, that may be true, but they don't, if you look at most technical specifications for applications, they say you need a minimum of how many CPUs, how many, gigahertz, whatever. They don't tell you what CPU family. That's important. The newer the family, you can have a lower gigahertz machine provide more output. The newer the CPU family, even with an older processor that seems to be a little bit faster because of core architecture and other things that come into play. Same thing goes with memory. Memory keeps getting faster. So that's another factor. So maybe if you're following to the letter the suggestions of the application vendor, after a while, it may make sense for you to come back and take a look at the performance of that VM, make sure that it's operating successfully. If it is, great. To be able to say that a machine is correctly sized, you should be operating anywhere from 60 to 80% utilization. That's not the norm that what we see with our customers. Usually we see 80% of our customers over provisioning machines, which means that they're basically just wasting money. How do we do that? Well, you would go, this is a screenshot of Azure. We would go into the virtual machine itself. And when you go to the overview section, you can see here the CPU average for this is 6%. Now, network, they're not really pushing a whole lot overall through the entire day. This is, 24 hours worth. I'm sorry, 30 days worth. So these are a day. So you can see, even though they're higher peak usage, network is probably fine. Disk at this point, I think, is a little bit slow, especially disk operation sections per second. And read, I'm sorry. But you see here, the biggest thing here is CPU average. We're using 6% of the CPU. So if we have, 4 CPUs, well, why don't we look for the same model of machine with lesser CPUs? And let's see what the performance impact is of that. Now, usually for domain controllers or things that are not utilized heavily all the time, unless you're using ADFS or a service like that, you're fine with getting away with a little bit less resources because you have more than one, right? You have 2 domain controllers. You have 2 web gateways, different kinds of solutions. For SQL Server, memory isn't really an indicator because SQL Server will take as much memory as you can get. Now, let's move on to, this is an example of a SQL Server here. You see now it constantly at 2%. The other one you saw more sporadic hits, right? Between 2 and 6%. This is constantly between 2 and 3%. This is obviously, disk operations per second. This means that it's running a process here and then it stops. Network is fine, disk is fine. Again, probably over provisioned. Now, the other thing that happens with over provisioning is not only are you paying more for the virtual machine to run, but if you're running a virtual machine with another Microsoft product on top of it, like SQL Server, like anything that requires a per CPU license, you're also paying more for that while in the cloud as well. Now, let's take an example of this. First is, now have in mind here, we're talking a DS16 V3 machine. It has 16 cores and 64 gigs of RAM. Would cost you roughly about almost $70,000 annually. The same machine, let's assume that we did the same study with the previous metrics and we downgraded it for, a fourth. We'd be saving almost 75% of its operational cost a year, right? Now, that doesn't mean that I need to be, again, the window of performance that I can see there is 30 days. That doesn't mean that the 30 days average the numbers weren't completely different. So when you're right sizing the machine either up or down, you need to make sure that you go back and check the performance at least, do the adjustment, make management aware of your stakeholders aware that you're going to be doing this adjustment, and just look at the numbers. It may work, it may not. It may work for a certain season of the year, may not for another, but it's something to take a look at, especially with cloud.
And that comes back to what you said earlier about taking a look at your business and taking a look at when your peak times are. Now, I've got a strong background in e-commerce and building e-commerce sites. And yes, from November to December, you are slammed in e-commerce. You don't need that size machine in January, February, and things are slow. Likewise, if you're in accounting, you're just getting into tax season now. You're going to probably be putting a lot more load on your servers, pulling on those line of business apps, pulling your databases, going through taxes. So you can't look at use in July to evaluate what your year-round usage is going to be.
Well, another point of that is just customer experience overall. There's usually we see, two types of customers. Customers that come to accept the status quo, meaning, oh, well, the system's slow, I won't say anything. Or the type of customer that actually says, hey, why is it slow? Can you help me? Usually we find that the latter type comes to find that they are either undersized for what they need. So they're losing money because they're actually losing productivity. If the system's slow, if I can only do 100 transactions a day versus 200, you can clearly see the business effect there. The other side of the coin is, well, the system's operating fine, I don't need to do anything, whatever. Great. But let's assume you're almost running an idle, then you're wasting money on the other end, which is, you're over provisioned. You're paying more than what you need. You don't need a Ferrari to go get milk and come back.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same analogy here. So that's basically an overview of what the exercise is. Now, the strategy to follow pretty much is do it one at a time. You don't want to downsize. If your solution's made up of a couple of virtual machines, you don't want to do them all at once. Why? Because you don't necessarily know where the performance hit's going to be. If you're running a fast database and a slow website, or if you're running a fast website and a slow database, the combination may be different. Like you mentioned, look at peak workloads. It's not the same. It will save you money. It will reduce your operational overhead just because of maintenance you need to do for larger disks, things of that nature. If you have a database that maybe you have the machine is incorrectly provisioned as far as disks go. Maybe you should be going on faster disks versus slower disks. Maybe you need to run an index defragmentation on a SQL Server database faster because you're on a slower disk. So that's more admin overhead. So there's a lot of factors that come into play here, especially when you have applications running on top of machines. And is about 80% of all the servers out there, right? You don't have a Windows server just to have a Windows server. You have a Windows server to run something on top of it. It also will help you liberate expenditures for other initiatives. Why? Usually every year you see the same thing consistent, both in commercial and government. You need to do more with less. Well, if you're in government, you know that you need to do more. You need to either spend the budget to get the same money assigned to you next year. But the problem then lies on, okay, well, how do I spend it smartly, right? If I'm not getting more money to do new things that I need to do, the best way of giving me that additional budget is to liberate funds from stuff that I don't need to be spending money on. So let's cost cuts on one end, which will free up money to do the other things that I need to do. Same goes pretty much with commercial, okay, you need to spend up for more machines. You don't need more money, we just need to spend it smartly. And finally, there's this kind of new machine that was introduced not too long ago, burstable machines. I wouldn't necessarily recommend these for everybody, but they're definitely something worth checking out. They actually are elastic enough to be able to give you more throughput and save you money when they're not in peak utilization. So it's something to play around with. I wouldn't necessarily say, hey guys, go out and change everything to B-Series virtual machines, because then we would definitely become very popular. It may not work for everybody, so we may, we may become popular not for the right reasons here. But definitely worth checking out. Definitely, if you have an application there that you only use it so much. Maybe you just have a remote desktop gateway box that you use to connect to the office when you're away and it's not really used. Maybe that's a good use for this. You save a couple of bucks here and there. So, definitely a conversation to have. And definitely, we're available for you guys to talk about. It's definitely a topic that, with our customers, we see the ones that consult, their resource utilization with us, they're within a couple of months, they actually see their return on investment.
All right, thank you very much, Miguel. And as always, you can see the recaps at agilit.com/news, where we keep our blog. We got a good Tech Talk section there. We have been collecting all of these. I'm going to go ahead and open the lines up for questions.